Have you ever wondered why we struggle to change our habits? It's often because we try to make big changes all at once, and then nothing sticks. To bring about significant transformation, we need to start small. Hello friends, welcome to Spoken Quora. Today, we're going to talk about the book Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg. Let's start. Henry was an ordinary guy, feeling stuck in his everyday life. At 25, he worked in a small town with big dreams but couldn't bring any discipline into his life. Every day, he'd think, tomorrow, everything will change. Henry's mornings often started late. He would hit the snooze button repeatedly, making his day begin on the wrong foot. By the time he finally dragged himself out of bed, it was almost time to leave for work. In the rush, he barely managed to get ready, skipping breakfast and sometimes even a glass of water. This chaotic start to the day set a negative tone, affecting his mood and productivity. At the office, Henry felt like he was constantly falling behind. His coworkers would often joke, "Hey man, why are you always late?" Henry didn't have a good answer. He knew he needed to change his habits, but every attempt ended in failure. His days at work were unproductive as his mind drifted, distracted by useless thoughts. On his way home, Henry would often feel exhausted. The burden of the day's work and his lack of progress weighed heavily on him. He'd think about doing something productive after work, like exercising, learning a new skill, or reading a book. But once he got home, he'd collapse onto the couch and start watching TV. This became his daily routine. Even while eating dinner, Henry would think about how unorganized his life was and that he needed to fix his routine. But where should he start? He couldn't figure it out, and it made him angry at himself for not being able to stick to something as simple as a routine. He often remembered his friends telling him, "If you plan properly, everything is possible." Henry knew he needed a change. He looked at people around him who woke up early, went to the gym, stayed energetic throughout the day, and still managed to be productive in the evenings. He believed he could do that too, but every time he tried, he failed. Many times, Henry planned to wake up early, but late night scrolling on his phone kept him up, and he'd end up sleeping through his alarm. He promised himself that things would get better the next day, but every new day only reminded him of his failures. Henry's biggest issue was distractions. Whenever he sat down to do something important, a notification on his phone would pull him away, and he'd get lost in endless scrolling through social media. He tried keeping his phone away multiple times but always found himself reaching for it. Once, he thought about making a to-do list to track his tasks for the day, but even that didn't last long. He worked hard to write down all his tasks and promised himself that he would focus on them throughout the day. But the very next day, his habits became his enemy again. As soon as he woke up, he got lost in his phone, and all his planning went down the drain. Henry was sinking deeper into guilt and stress with each passing day, unable to bring any meaningful change into his life. He felt like he wasn't good at anything. His friends and family tried to encourage him, but he couldn't figure out why he was failing to improve his routine. Every night when he lay in bed, he'd think about all the things he hadn't accomplished during the day. The guilt consumed him, and he berated himself for being unable to do even the simplest tasks. Will I ever achieve something great in my life? This question haunted him daily. Henry had come to terms with the fact that his life couldn't continue this way. He knew that he needed a major change, but how to make it happen still eluded him. He had searched the internet for solutions, watched motivational videos, but the excitement they brought only lasted a few hours. Then his old habits would pull him right back. Now, Henry's biggest challenge was staying motivated and changing his habits. He understood that if he didn't take action soon, his life would continue wasting away. He promised himself that he would try again, but he had no idea where to begin. Henry's mind was filled with questions but no answers. He was searching for something that could guide him in the right direction and help him boost his productivity. But at that moment, all he had were his old habits and failed attempts. Henry's story wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning of a turning point in his life, where he needed to transform himself. But how? That was the question that kept running through his mind. His life continued on the same old path. Every day he tried to make a change, but every time he failed. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, and our videos have touched your life or made a difference for you. Your support means more than words can express. By donating to our UPI account number in the description, you're not just contributing to our work, you're becoming a part of our mission and our story. Your generosity helps us keep the passion alive and create even more content that matters. Thank you for your kindness and support from the bottom of our hearts. Now, let's get back to the summary. Henry couldn't focus on his work and kept failing at changing his habits. One day, while feeling overwhelmed, he sat at a cafe near his town. His face clearly showed signs of exhaustion and frustration. He silently stared into his cup of coffee as if all of life's problems were hidden inside it. Just then, his eyes fell on an elderly man sitting at a nearby table. The man was reading a book and occasionally jotting down notes. There was a deep understanding in his eyes and a calm smile on his face. Henry couldn't resist his curiosity and glanced at the book the man was reading. It was titled Tiny Habits, The Small Changes That Change Everything. Henry felt a spark of interest. It seemed like the solution to his problems might be hidden in that book. After thinking for a moment, he gathered the courage to approach the elderly man. "Excuse me, sir," Henry hesitated, "may I ask you something?" The elderly man smiled warmly and said, "Of course, my boy. What's on your mind?" "I noticed you're reading a book called Tiny Habits. Is it about changing habits?" Henry asked, hopeful. The elderly man nodded and replied, "Yes, this book is about improving habits through small, gradual changes." Henry's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "Sir, I've been trying to change my habits for a long time but keep failing. Could you give me some advice?" The elderly man adjusted his glasses and said, "I understand your struggle, son. You see, we often aim for big changes, but it's the small changes that lead us in the right direction. This book explains just that." He invited Henry to sit closer and opened the first chapter of the book. In this book, BJ Fogg introduces a simple behavior model called B=MAP. It means that for any behavior to occur, three things are essential: motivation, M, ability, A, and prompt, P. The right combination of these three helps in building or changing a habit. Henry thought for a moment and asked, "But sir, how does this work?" The elderly man explained, "Well, let's start with behavior, B. It's the thing you want to do or change. Now, MAP stands for motivation, ability, and prompt, three factors that shape your behavior." He looked at Henry and said, "If you have the motivation, but if you don't have the ability, you won't be able to do it. And if you have the ability but lack motivation, it will still be difficult. That's why you need the right balance of all three. Most importantly, behavior will only happen when all three are working together at the same time," the elderly man explained. Henry was starting to understand. "So if my motivation is good and my ability is strong, then I can change my behavior?" The elderly man smiled and nodded, "Exactly. That's what BJ Fogg explains in his model. Motivation is never constant, it fluctuates. But if you make your behavior easier, meaning you increase your ability, then even with low motivation, you can still succeed." Taking a deep breath, Henry asked, "So, sir, does that mean I need to make my habits simpler so that I can do them even when my motivation is low?" The elderly man nodded, "Yes, absolutely. If you set big goals right from the start, you'll give up when your motivation dips. That's why you should start with small and easy steps. This is the first lesson of tiny habits: make small, easy changes. For example, if you want to wake up early, start by going to bed on time. If you want to start exercising, begin with just 2 minutes of walking. Hearing this, Henry felt a sense of relief. He had always thought he needed to achieve big goals immediately, but now he realized that even small steps can lead to significant change. So the simpler and more manageable I make it, the more successful I'll be? Henry asked eagerly. Exactly, said the elderly man. When you make a behavior easier, your ability increases, and you don't need as much motivation. And the most important thing is the prompt. This is what gives you the signal to take action. For example, if you want to exercise every morning, put your running shoes next to your bed. That way, you'll have a reminder as soon as you wake up. Henry was beginning to understand why he had failed before. He always set big goals and put too much pressure on himself. When his motivation dropped, he would give up. But now, he realized that he needed to take small steps and make his behavior so easy that he could accomplish it even with low motivation. The elderly man concluded by saying, "Remember, son, habits don't change overnight. But if you start the right way and make gradual progress, you'll definitely see a change one day. And most importantly, always believe in yourself," the elderly man said. Henry thanked the elderly man and thought to himself that today would be the start of something new. He decided to go home and work on improving his habits, breaking them down into small, manageable parts. Henry's journey had now taken a new direction, but this was just the beginning. He still had a lot to learn and discipline to build into his life. He promised himself that this time, he wouldn't give up. As Henry walked home that day, he felt a sense of relief. It seemed like the problems in his life were beginning to unravel, little by little. The lesson that the elderly man had taught him, B equals map, behavior equals motivation, ability, and prompt, kept repeating in his mind. For the first time, he realized why he had been failing. He had always set big goals that required constant motivation, and when his motivation waned, he would stop. The next day, Henry decided that he would meet the elderly man again to learn more. He returned to the same cafe where he had met the elderly man the day before. To Henry's delight, the man was sitting in the same spot, reading his book. Without wasting time, Henry approached him and humbly said, "Sir, may I sit with you again today? I found your advice really helpful." The elderly man smiled and motioned for him to sit. "Of course, son, I'm here to help you." As Henry sat down, he said, "Sir, I thought a lot about what you told me yesterday, and now I understand why I kept failing. Now, I want to know what my next step should be." The elderly man listened carefully to Henry and, after taking a deep breath, said, "Son, now that you've grasped the first lesson, the next step is learning about tiny habits. It's the small but important step that will help you reach your bigger goals." Henry, filled with curiosity, asked, "Tiny habits? What's that, sir?" The elderly man closed his book and explained, "Look, son, when it comes to making life changes, we often think we need to make big adjustments all at once, but in reality, we often think that we need to take big steps to bring about change, but in reality, transformation starts with small steps." That's the main message of BJ Fogg's book Tiny Habits. It explains that we should begin with very small actions that can be done in less than 30 seconds. Henry looked surprised and asked, "Less than 30 seconds?" The elderly man smiled and said, "Yes, the essence of tiny habits is to make your habits so small and easy that they don't feel like a challenge. For instance, if you want to work on your fitness, don't start with an hour-long workout on the first day. Instead, begin with just 2 push-ups." Henry shook his head and asked, "But sir, what's the benefit of such tiny steps?" The elderly man leaned back in his chair and replied, "Son, that's precisely the point. Small steps are the building blocks of significant change. When you start with tiny habits, you're preparing your mind to accept them. Once they become a habit, you can gradually build on them. Curious, Henry asked, "Sir, can you give me a real-life example?" The elderly man thought for a moment and then said, "Yes, certainly. Let me tell you a story about a friend of mine named Arjun. Arjun always wanted to focus on his fitness, but he could never stay motivated enough to go to the gym. He signed up for gym memberships several times, but after a week or two, his motivation would wane, and he'd return to his old routine. One day, I told him about tiny habits and advised him to set a small, achievable goal. I told him, "Arjun, just do 2 push-ups every morning when you wake up. That's your goal." He laughed at first and said, "What will 2 push-ups do?" But I explained that it would help train his mind to form a new habit. Henry listened intently as the elderly man continued. Arjun took my advice and started with just 2 push-ups. Initially, it seemed pointless to him, but gradually, he began doing it every day. After a few weeks, he noticed that he could do 2 push-ups effortlessly. Then he increased it to 5 push-ups, then 10, and eventually he was doing 20 push-ups every day. All this was achieved through small, incremental steps. Henry, astonished, asked, "So can small steps really lead to big changes?" The elderly man nodded and said, "Absolutely. That's the magic of tiny habits. When you adopt small habits, your mind accepts them easily. Once the habit is established, you can expand it." Arjun's example proves that small steps can indeed lead to significant change. Henry absorbed this lesson carefully and promised himself that he would work on improving his habits by breaking them down into smaller, manageable parts. He decided that instead of rushing towards big goals from day one, he would start with small steps. Turning to the elderly man, Henry said, "Sir, now I understand how I should begin. I'm going to start breaking my habits into smaller parts and work on them from today. But I have one question: what if my motivation drops?" The elderly man smiled and replied, "That's the beauty of tiny habits. When you start with small steps, you don't need as much motivation. Your behavior starts to change on its own, and then a lack of motivation won't hold you back. You'll see that as you adopt these small steps, both your confidence and ability will grow." Henry thanked the elderly man and, as he was heading home, felt as if he had learned a crucial lesson in his life. He was now confident that he could reach his goals, as long as he started with small steps. Henry's journey had taken a new direction, and he decided to begin with the simple goal of doing just 2 push-ups every morning. He promised himself that he would practice this daily, no matter what. This was his first step towards significant change. As Henry learned the second lesson from the elderly man, he felt a surge of new energy. He believed that he could indeed bring about a significant change in his life if he took the right small steps. However, he still had some questions. He wanted to understand this new knowledge more deeply so he could firmly integrate these habits into his life. Sitting in the cafe, he asked the elderly man, "Sir, you've taught me about tiny habits, and I'm going to apply them from today. But can you share anything else that could help me on this journey?" The elderly man smiled at him and said, "Absolutely, son. You're on the right path. Starting with small steps is the right way, but what I'm about to teach you will make your journey even easier. It's called anchors." Henry looked a bit puzzled and asked, "Anchors? What does that mean, sir?" The elderly man relaxed in his chair and explained, "Anchors are about linking a new habit with an existing one. For example, brushing your teeth in the morning is already a part of your routine. If you add a new habit to this routine, like doing 5 squats right after brushing your teeth, that new habit will become part of the existing routine. This makes it easier to remember and maintain the new habit. We call this anchoring." Henry nodded and asked, "But sir, does this method really make it easier to adopt new habits?" The elderly man smiled and said, "Absolutely. When we attach a new habit to an old routine, that new habit becomes a part of the existing routine. This not only makes it easier to adopt the new habit but also helps in maintaining it. Anchors are used to strengthen the roots of habits." Henry asked, "Sir, can you give me a real-life example of this?" The elderly man thought for a moment and said, "Sure, let me share a story from my own life. When I was your age, I also wanted to focus on my fitness, but my routine was very inconsistent. Sometimes I would go to the gym, and other times, I wouldn't do anything for weeks. One day, a friend of mine introduced me to anchoring. He told me that if I really wanted to make fitness a part of my life, I needed to link it with my daily routine. At first, it seemed a bit strange to me, but I decided to give it a try. I made a small change to my morning routine. After brushing my teeth each morning, I started doing 10 squats right outside the bathroom. It was a tiny change, but it was easy to do because brushing my teeth was already part of my routine. Within a few weeks, this habit became a regular part of my routine, and gradually, I added push-ups and stretches. Now, maintaining my fitness routine is no problem because it has become a part of my established routine." Henry listened and said, "Sir, that sounds really simple. But does it really work that well?" The elderly man nodded and said, "Yes, that's the power of anchoring. When we link a new habit with an existing routine, the new habit becomes more sustainable. Gradually, you'll find that it becomes easier to stick with the new habit because it's now a part of your routine." Henry listened carefully and tried to understand this lesson. He thought about adding new habits to his current routine to achieve his goals more easily. He asked, "Sir, if I add some new habits to my morning routine, will that be beneficial?" The elderly man nodded and said, "Absolutely, son. When you add new habits to your existing routine, it's easier to remember and maintain them. For example, if you brush your teeth every morning, you can add a habit of meditating for 2 minutes afterward, or keeping your phone away before bed. Small habits pave the way to achieving big goals." Henry reflected and said, "So, it means I need to focus on my existing routine and gradually incorporate new habits into it." The elderly man smiled and said, "Yes, you've understood it perfectly. But remember, this needs to be done slowly and with patience. No major change happens overnight. Only when a habit fully becomes a part of your life can you move on to the next step. Each new habit will become a new anchor that helps you reach your bigger goals." Henry decided to start with his morning routine. He said to the elderly man, "Sir, I'm going to apply this lesson to my life starting today. I'll make some small changes to my morning routine and integrate them into my habits." The elderly man replied with a smile, "That's the right approach. Son, when you wake up in the morning, brush your teeth and then do 2 push-ups or squats. Gradually increase the number as you go along. This will be your first anchor that will guide you on your journey with habits." Henry resolved to adopt this new lesson into his life with full sincerity. He decided to start making small changes in his routine from today and work on them consistently. He thanked the elderly man and said, "Sir, you've given me a new direction today. I now believe I can definitely achieve my goals." The elderly man smiled and said, "Remember, son, every change begins with small steps. When you connect your habits with strong anchors, no goal will be too difficult for you." Henry had learned many lessons from the elderly man and had started incorporating tiny habits and anchoring into his life, but his journey was not over yet. He knew that the elderly man had more wisdom that could further strengthen his habits. He continued to sit with the elderly man in the cafe, eagerly awaiting the next lesson. The elderly man noticed the curiosity in Henry's eyes and said, "Son, now I'm going to teach you one more important lesson. This lesson is perhaps the most practical because it focuses not on motivation, but on ability. Henry asked with a hint of surprise, "Ability over motivation, sir? Could you explain what you mean?" The elderly man leaned back comfortably in his chair and said, "Look, son, motivation is temporary. It comes and goes. When you're trying to adopt a new habit, your motivation can sometimes wane, and when it does, you might not stick to the habit. So, you shouldn't rely solely on motivation." Henry listened carefully but didn't fully understand yet. He asked, "So, what should we do instead?" The elderly man explained, "You should focus on your ability, meaning how easy you can make the task. If a task feels easy to do, you won't need much motivation. For example, if you want to drink more water, keep a water bottle with you at all times. This way, whenever you feel thirsty, you'll have water available and you'll drink it without much thought. You won't need to rely on motivation because you've made it easy." Henry heard this idea but needed a real-life example to understand it better. He asked, "Sir, can you give me a real-life example of this?" The elderly man smiled and said, "Certainly. Let me give you a very normal but effective example. A friend of mine always wanted to get into the habit of waking up early, but his motivation would often drop. Sometimes he would hit the snooze button on his alarm or feel too cold to get out of bed." Henry chuckled a bit and said, "Sir, that happens to me too. I often struggle to get up in the morning." The elderly man nodded and said, "That's true, it happens to all of us. Now, look at what my friend did. He made his morning routine easier. He kept his workout clothes and shoes right by his bed so he wouldn't have to think much when he woke up, everything was ready for him. He also placed his alarm across the room so he had to get out of bed to turn it off. Gradually, it became easier for him to wake up and exercise. He didn't need as much motivation anymore because he had improved his ability to get the job done." Henry listened and said, "Sir, that really does sound easy. So, should I also make my habits easier in this way?" The elderly man replied, "Absolutely, son. If you want your new habits to be more sustainable, you need to make them easier. The easier the task, the less motivation you'll need, and you'll be able to maintain your habits consistently." Henry understood the lesson well and decided to make some tasks easier for himself so that he wouldn't have to rely on motivation constantly. He told the elderly man, "Sir, I will keep a water bottle with me to improve my water intake habit, and I might also make my morning workout routine easier so that I don't have to think too much about it." The elderly man nodded in agreement and said, "That's the right approach, son. If you make your tasks easier, you won't need motivation. Gradually, these habits will become a part of your life." Henry was determined to simplify his habits even further. He also wondered how he could further enhance his ability. He asked the elderly man, "Sir, can you give me more examples of how I can make tasks easier?" The elderly man thought for a moment and said, "You already have an existing routine, right? Like waking up in the morning, having breakfast, or getting ready for the office. Now, try adding small habits into these routines. For example, if you have breakfast every morning, you could stretch for 5 minutes before breakfast. If you always wear headphones while going to the office, you could listen to motivational podcasts to remind yourself. As these small habits grow, you'll see how your life changes." Henry took these suggestions to heart and decided to implement this lesson in his life immediately. He resolved to make his daily tasks easier so he could perform them without any interruptions. He thanked the elderly man and said, "Sir, you've given me another new direction today. I now understand that I shouldn't rely too much on motivation but should focus on improving my ability instead." The elderly man smiled and said, "Remember, son, the easier a task seems to you, the longer you'll stick with it. And when you repeat it often enough, it will become a habit. You won't need motivation because it will have become a part of your life." Henry understood this lesson well and resolved to make his tasks easier. He knew that if he adopted this lesson, he could strengthen his habits even further. As Henry reflected on all the lessons he had learned from the elderly man, he had already begun to see improvements in his life by keeping his habits small and simple. But there were still areas where he was struggling. Sometimes, he felt that he wasn't doing things right or that he was making mistakes. Henry wanted to understand more deeply how he could better design his habits. The elderly man sensed Henry's confusion and smiled, saying, "Son, I can see that you're now taking your habits even more seriously. But remember, designing habits has a method, and the first thing you need to do is stop judging yourself." Henry, surprised, asked, "Stop judging myself? Sir, how is that possible? If I don't judge myself, how will I know whether I'm doing it right or wrong?" The elderly man took a deep breath and explained, "Look, son, when we try to adopt a new habit and make a mistake, we often judge ourselves harshly. We think we'll never succeed, and this negative thinking holds us back." Henry listened carefully as the elderly man continued, "The most important thing here is to learn to forgive yourself. Habit development is a process, and making mistakes is natural. If you keep judging yourself every time, you won't be able to move forward." The elderly man gave an example. "Let me tell you about another friend of mine. His dream was to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning and do yoga. He did this for a few days, but then one day, he overslept. When he woke up, he blamed himself harshly and said he'd never be able to stick to the habit." Henry asked, "So what did he do then?" "He stopped judging himself," the elderly man said with a smile. He realized that one day's mistake didn't mean he had failed completely. After that day, he tried again to wake up early, and after a few more days, his habit was back on track. If he had kept judging himself, he might never have formed the habit. Henry listened attentively and thought, "Maybe I judge myself too much. Whenever I fail to stick to a habit, I feel guilty." The elderly man nodded and said, "Remember, son, making mistakes is human nature. Forgive yourself and move on. This is the first key to designing habits." The elderly man then explained the next principle. "Now, the second principle is to break your big goals into smaller parts. Often, we dream of big achievements, but accomplishing them becomes difficult." Henry asked, "So what should we do, sir?" The elderly man elaborated, "You may have a big dream, like studying for an hour every day or going to the gym every day. But if you aim directly for the big goal, the path will seem hard. Instead, break your big goal into small tasks. For example, if you want to go to the gym every day, start with a 10-minute workout. When the 10-minute workout feels easy, you can gradually increase it." Henry understood the importance of these lessons and realized how essential it was to stop judging himself and start small in order to achieve lasting habits. The elderly man shared another story. "Once upon a time, another friend of mine had always planned to run 5 kilometers every day. But after running for 1 or 2 days, he would run out of energy and give up. I advised him to start with just 500 meters. For the first few days, he ran 500 meters, then increased to 1 kilometer, and gradually reached 5 kilometers. If he had tried to run 5 kilometers right away, he might have always ended up exhausted and defeated." Henry understood this idea well and thought that he should also break down his big goals into smaller parts so that they wouldn't seem impossible. The elderly man added, "Remember, big changes come from taking small steps. If you focus on small tasks, one day your big dream will come true." The elderly man then introduced the third and final principle: don't consider mistakes as your enemy. Treat them as a learning opportunity. When we make mistakes, we have 2 options: we can either see them as failures or view them as discoveries. Henry asked, "Discoveries? What do you mean by that?" The elderly man explained, when you make a mistake, look for the lesson hidden within it. For example, if you fail to stick to a habit, try to understand why it didn't work. Was the habit too difficult for you? Should you have made it easier? Did you plan it correctly? By finding answers to these questions, you can learn from your mistakes and use them as a foundation for future success. The elderly man provided another example. One of my students wanted to develop the habit of reading a book every day. He initially planned to read for an hour each day. For the first 2 days, he managed to read for an hour, but on the third day, he was so tired that he couldn't even pick up the book. He felt he wouldn't succeed. However, he learned from his mistake. He realized that reading for an hour was too ambitious for him, so he reduced it to 15 minutes. Gradually, he started reading 15 minutes every day and eventually increased it to an hour. If he hadn't learned from his mistake, he might never have developed the reading habit. Henry absorbed this lesson as well and understood that mistakes are not just signs of failure but opportunities for learning. He decided to delve deeper into understanding his mistakes and use them as strengths. Having grasped all 3 lessons, Henry resolved to stop judging himself, break down his big goals into smaller parts, and learn from his mistakes. He thanked the elderly man and said, "Sir, you've completely changed my perspective. I will now design my habits more effectively." The elderly man smiled and said, "Remember, son, designing habits is also an art. If you create them correctly, no habit will be out of your reach." Henry decided that day to bring even greater changes to his life with this new knowledge. His habits would now be stronger than ever, and he wouldn't fear making mistakes. A new dawn had arrived in Henry's life. The lessons from the elderly man had transformed his thinking, habits, and way of living. Where Henry had once been discouraged by his daily failures and mistakes, he was now filled with confidence and new energy. He not only adopted the habits taught by the elderly man but also used them in real life to transform his entire existence. The first change Henry made in his life was to stop judging himself. Previously, whenever he tried to adopt a new habit and failed on any given day, he would blame himself and feel that he would never succeed. But now, he took the elderly man's advice seriously and learned to forgive himself. Henry began with a small example. He was trying to wake up early every morning. Previously, if he woke up 1 or 2 days late, he would succumb to his perceived failure. However, he now understood that one day's mistake didn't mean the whole plan was a failure. Instead of judging himself, he started to think about why he woke up late that day. He worked on understanding his sleep patterns better and realized that he needed to go to bed a bit earlier to wake up on time. This small change proved to be a significant step towards improving his habits. Now, he no longer judges himself but tries to learn from each mistake. Henry's second major change was breaking down his big dreams and goals into smaller parts. Previously, he would set very ambitious goals like studying for 2 hours a day or going to the gym 5 times a week. But now, he understood the elderly man's advice and started breaking his goals into smaller tasks. He first applied this technique to his study routine. Henry had always wanted to study for 2 hours a day but could never fully achieve it. When the elderly man advised starting with small steps, Henry took it seriously. He set a goal to read for just 15 minutes a day initially. It was a small goal, but he could easily accomplish it. Gradually, he increased his reading time from 15 minutes to 30 minutes, and then to an hour. A few weeks later, he had completely fulfilled his old desire to read for 2 hours a day. He realized how effective small steps were in reaching big goals. Not only in studying but he also applied the same method to his fitness goals. Instead of thinking about spending an entire hour at the gym, he started with just 10 minutes of exercise. Slowly, he increased this and eventually managed to work out for an hour. Henry's third major lesson in life was to view mistakes not as failures but as learning opportunities. Previously, whenever he made a mistake, he considered himself defeated and felt his efforts were in vain. But the elderly man taught him that mistakes are not failures but chances to learn. Henry began to learn something new from every mistake. For example, if he failed to follow his fitness schedule on a particular day, instead of blaming himself, he would reflect on why he was unsuccessful. He would consider whether the schedule was too difficult, if it needed to be made easier, or if he had planned his day incorrectly. Henry had now fully embraced these 3 lessons: to stop judging himself, to break down big goals into smaller parts, and to learn from mistakes. He thanked the elderly man and resolved to design his habits more effectively. Henry decided that he would bring even greater changes to his life with this new knowledge. His habits were now stronger than ever, and he no longer feared making mistakes. A new dawn had arrived in Henry's life, as the lessons from the elderly man had completely transformed his thinking, habits, and way of living. Once Henry had failed to go to the gym for 3 consecutive days, he no longer saw it as a failure. Instead, he thought perhaps his gym timing wasn't right. He adjusted his schedule and changed his gym time from morning to evening. This small change helped him maintain a consistent gym routine. Henry had now understood that embracing and learning from mistakes was key to achieving his goals. After incorporating all 3 lessons into his life, Henry witnessed real changes. Where he had once been constantly frustrated and disheartened, he was now brimming with self-confidence. His approach to studying also improved significantly. Previously, he would get overwhelmed during exams and couldn't complete his preparation. But now, he had changed his study method. He started with just 15 minutes of study each day and gradually worked up to 2 hours. This gradual approach made studying less stressful, and he was able to prepare more effectively. His exam results began to improve as well. Henry also found success in fitness. Where he previously struggled to go to the gym for weeks, he now exercised regularly. He began with small workouts and slowly increased his fitness level. Now, he went to the gym for an hour every day, and his body became fitter than ever. Henry's confidence soared. Where he once would get disheartened by small issues, he now viewed each challenge as an opportunity to learn and grow. His life was not limited to just studying and fitness, he applied these habits to other areas of his life as well. Henry thought if he could improve study and fitness by breaking them down into small parts, he could also develop other skills similarly. He decided to learn the guitar but started with small tasks. He began by playing the guitar for just 5 minutes a day. Gradually, he increased this to 30 minutes, and after a few months, he had learned to play several songs well. Henry also improved his relationships. Previously, whenever he was away from friends or family, he would feel guilty for not spending enough time with them. Now, he started breaking his time into smaller chunks and dedicated 10 minutes daily to connect with family and friends. This strengthened his relationships and made him feel more emotionally balanced. In his career, Henry applied these habits by breaking down large projects into smaller tasks and working on them bit by bit each day. This approach not only helped him complete his work on time but also improved the quality of his output. A few months later, Henry visited the elderly man again. His eyes sparkled, and his face was full of self-confidence. He was eager to share stories about his new life. The elderly man saw the sparkle in Henry's eyes and smiled. Henry said, "Sir, what you taught me has completely transformed my life. I no longer judge myself. I am achieving big goals by taking small steps and learning from my mistakes." The elderly man said gently, "Son, this is the true essence of life. If you design your habits the right way, nothing is impossible." Henry thanked the elderly man and promised to keep this knowledge in his life forever. His story didn't end here, it was just the beginning of a new journey towards a successful, balanced, and happy life. So, friends, that was our book summary for today. How did you like it? Please let us know in the comments, and thank you for listening to the summary till the end.